G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we're looking at my team selection for race week 10 ahead of the Spanish Grand Prix. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. We'll get straight into how my team performed in Canada and all of the key takeaways before we look at my early team thoughts for Spain. I had 101 points all out, which all things considered was not the worst outcome across the weekend. And we'll get to the chaos of Sunday in a moment. But the fact that free practice on Friday and Saturday was so mixed, there was no clear decision to me and to most F1 fantasy strategists as to what the optimal team build was. The simulations on 11fi, on F1 fantasy tools were all over the shop, very different schools of thought. And so I elected to use the free practice run times as my thought process heading into the weekend. The wet weather ultimately would spell some chaos in the Grand Prix, and that was the rationale for me using the autopilot chip. It was rather a knee-jerk decision based on free practice 3 results, because up until that point, I was more than likely going to run Charles Leclerc, but Lewis very much convinced me in that last practice session he was worth having a punt and bringing in the Mercedes constructor in favor of Oscar Piastri and McLaren. So all in all, it paid off using the autopilot. Otherwise, I would have run Charles, and that very much was a disastrous outcome for him and for Ferrari on Sunday. He and Sainz just didn't look all together at all across Friday and Saturday. They were out in Q2, not to mention Sergio Perez also went out in Q1. And then Leclerc seemed to be having engine issues throughout the entire race. Ferrari went back to their old ways and put him on a hard tire while the track was still wet. He was losing, I think, about 7 seconds at one point per sector while everyone else was on intermediate tires. And then they ultimately decided to retire the car. Sainz, again, was tangled up with Alex Albon. So that double DNF for Ferrari, and then also for Williams, given Sargent hit the wall as well, meant that there was very few F1 fantasy strategists that escaped Canada without a single DNF. So I bore the brunt of quite a few of them, but the Lewis Hamilton autopilot really saved me there. I think if you had anything upwards of 80 or 90 points, you can consider Canada a win just because of the amount of chaos that happened on track. So I had a small red arrow down to 3.8 from 3.2 overall. I'll take that 9 times out of 10, to be honest. It was a pretty insane weekend in terms of F1 fantasy. And in the case of Monaco, on the back of that and the number of DNFs that ruined people's race weekends then, I've been very lucky. I'd consider myself very lucky, and I escaped some of the worst outcomes then. Even though I got bitten by a little bit here, I'd still take this, all things considered, and the autopilot chip was a win for me. So moving on to Spain, I think there's a few team decisions to be made, but realistically, quite a few key talking points which I want to get into here. The first one I want to cover off was Mercedes' performance across the board. Now, I mentioned how good they looked in free practice, and George Russell took pole position on Saturday. There was some cause for optimism, given historically Mercedes this season have been a team that have looked good in practice and then just taken a couple steps back during the race. But I think it was the first weekend where they just seemed to have all of the parts functioning. They were a cohesive unit. Even though Lewis qualified P7, he had a pretty dodgy qualifying lap in Q3. He actually set the fastest qualifying time across all 3 qualifying sessions on Saturday. So it all rolled up into what was ultimately the best fantasy result for a constructor since when George took out his first F1 victory in Brazil 2022, where the constructor had 111 points then. So a great weekend for Mercedes constructor owners. I definitely think they're building towards more consistent, good results. And even though both drivers were critical of their performance on track, I think they are now entering the discussion. I wouldn't say they're quite at Ferrari, Red Bull and McLaren level, but I do think they're certainly in the conversation to at least think about week in, week out. So a great result for them. On the contrary, Ferrari had a stinker. I talked about Leclerc and Sainz's struggles. It's their worst result since Baku, where they had a -13. It was actually worse than Baku, where they had -16 in Canada. But in terms of since when F1 Fantasy scores have been recorded their worst result, and they haven't had a negative score quite that damaging in the last 2 years. So a terrible result for them. Sainz, Leclerc and Ferrari Constructor all went down in value, but I don't think that suddenly writes them off in terms of an F1 Fantasy asset to own. Yes, it wasn't a great weekend for them, but I think if you look at their value compared to the rest of the drivers and constructors, the only other team I could maybe make the argument for as best value would be Haas. But I think when you've got the likes of Leclerc, who's clinically outperforming every other asset in the B tier class, as also a 2X driver, yes, it was not great for people who ran Leclerc as their 2X, but that's just not going to happen every week. So I definitely think Leclerc still deserves a lot of thought as the best 2X driver, if we're not including Max Verstappen in the conversation there. In terms of how the recent results have implicated price changes in the game, we've had 11 different drivers. Hamilton's been the only driver that's had back-to-back $1 million increases that have gone up by that much over these last 2 race weekends. I don't think we've ever had that in F1 Fantasy as far as I can remember, but a lot of that also is pinned on the fact that there have been so many DNFs of late, which has brought the average score down. And as a result, when the average score is lower, you don't need as many points to go up in price. So that's obviously what's driving these drastic price swings, but it does mean that some assets that might have been attainable in price a couple of weeks ago, I'm looking at the Haas boys after their DNFs in Monaco, maybe not be quite as price friendly at the moment. So definitely a huge swing in certain prices for certain drivers, but it has been reassuring that no one other than Lewis Hamilton has had back-to-back $1 million increases. So it means that's more or less just the nature of the game, and when those price changes shake out, it's just based on one good performance from the previous race week. One driver in particular that's coming off a $1 million increase is Lance Stroll. He's approaching the B tier asset class. He's currently at 14.2, so 0.8 million short of hitting that $15 million threshold, where your price increases are not going to be quite as much as what you would be if you were under 15 million. I've got a video on my channel if you still are unsure as to how the price changes in the game are dictated, so check that out. But I do think that makes a very compelling case to get Stroll into your team in Spain and in Austria, where we've got that third sprint race coming up where points are going to be slightly higher, and as a result, you'd think price changes are going to mirror what you score that weekend too. So I think he's got only so much room to move. Once he hits that B tier asset class, very hard to justify having him as an asset in your team when you've got drivers like Tsunoda, Hülkenberg and Magnussen doing just as, if not more than he is in terms of an F1 fantasy asset. So interesting for Stroll and his potential suitors heading into Spain. I think the other thing, and I've talked about this a lot on Twitter and in preseason videos, is the need to change the scoring metrics for driver of the day and DNS. I think I could talk about this for 20, 30 minutes if I wanted to. I'm not going to bore you to death, but I do think 10 points for the driver of the day is just way too much in a fantasy game, which is largely strategy based. Having a fan vote for the driver of the day or the man of the match just doesn't seem right, where it's worth more than what a mid-points finish would be, around the 8 to 10 point mark. So I really think driver of the day next season needs to come down to about 5 points. Hopefully the developers or someone from F1 watching this takes this into consideration, because I definitely think it's just giving too much credit to something that we can't really plan for. You have no idea who the driver of the day is going to be in free practice, whereas you do know who's just going to have a good weekend more often than not based on those times. As for DNFs, minus 20, I continue to stress, is just too much of a penalty. And you look at the likes of people who ran Charles Leclerc as their 2X in Canada, it just cripples your points for the weekend and your rank when you end up with a DNF on that 2X multiplier. So I would love to see that come back down to a minus 10. Minus 10 was what the DNF penalty in 2022 was when there were the old game developers. So I would love to see that come back down to around that mark, because it is very frustrating when you have someone like, in my case, Leclerc, Sargent, Ferrari. I'm not going to complain, because everyone's been bitten by the DNF bug at one point or another, certainly in the last couple of weeks. If you've avoided all DNFs in Monaco and Canada, go and buy yourself a lottery ticket right now. But I think these point scoring metrics need to change in 2025. I'm going to take a quick look at a couple of drivers on the watch list and whether or not they should deserve some consideration for Spain. I think George Russell is the first one that comes to mind for me. He's had a really strong last couple of weeks, and a lot of that has been based on the fact that Mercedes have brought a few extra upgrades. I mentioned that they're building towards a good result. And he's had double-digit point scoring results in every race this season except for Australia, where he had a -3. So I do think he's got some potential there. You look at the likes of Sergio Perez, Carlos Sainz, they're both, I think, falling out of favor in F1 fantasy circles. Piastri, for me, I think has edged ahead of Sainz even before Canada in F1 fantasy circles. So I do think after Piastri, it's probably Russell and then Hamilton / Sainz there. And I think Hamilton's points in Canada were slightly inflated with that fastest lap. So George is a driver that's, I think, outqualified Lewis in every race weekend except one this season. And I do believe he will be receiving some preferential treatment as he will be with the team beyond this season, unlike Lewis, who we know is moving to Ferrari. So I do think that works in favor of George just a little bit. In terms of positions gained and overtakes, sure, I don't think that's really going to direct the discussion one way or another. For George Russell, Mercedes are clearly a top 4 team at the moment. They're always, or almost always, going to be in Q3. So I think the fact that he's lost a couple of positions per race, it's largely just semantics, I think, based on where he qualifies. Certainly, if he's qualifying P4 with a car earlier in the season, he'd lose those positions to the Ferraris and the McLarens behind him, for example. But I think at 9%, the lowest owned asset in the game, and the fact that you can switch him out for a Sainz or a Perez makes George Russell a really appealing fantasy asset to me as of right now. I also want to give a shout out before we get on to Pierre Gasly to UNFPL for this suggestion. For George Russell, he was going to cover it, I believe, in his red light, yellow light, green light segment over on his YouTube channel. And I did have another driver in that slot, but George, after his result in Canada, certainly made me want to just cover him off before we get into Pierre Gasly. So thanks to Ewan for the suggestion there. Pierre Gasly is the other driver I am thinking about heading into Spain. And the reason I say that is, well, there are several reasons I want to say that, but I think one of them in particular is, much like George Russell, I think Pierre is going to see a bit more favorable treatment, team orders. I think that will be to his benefit now that we know Ocon will not be with Alpine beyond this season. There was certainly publicized team radio messages between Ocon and his race engineer that he was fuming. He had to give up a place to Pierre Gasly in the closing stages of Canada and wasn't returned the place when Gasly couldn't overtake Ricciardo. So I do think this theme more or less will continue heading into the rest of the season. Gasly, I've talked about as a driver that at that $8 to $9 million price point may not be the best asset to own when you look at Tsunoda, Hülkenberg, Magnussen, for instance. But I do like the fact that Alpine is continuing to build to a low points finish most race weeks. His qualifying performances have improved, which I think as an F1 fantasy asset in the midfield or as a back market team, maybe not the best thing, but he went out, I believe it was the bottom of Q2 in Canada. So with 14 points off the back of his drive most recently, even though he had 1s and 2s in Italy and Monaco, he's had 3 double-digit performances now in the last 5 races. And I definitely think if Alpine can continue to get their act together, make it clear, at least to me, that Pierre Gasly is going to be the prioritized driver in that lineup. I really like him. We know how good he is with his racecraft. 4.6 points per race is certainly underestimating what his recent form is, given how dreadful the Alpine was to start the year. And at 25% ownership, I don't think he is mind-blowing differential, just because I think most drivers at that price are pretty similarly owned. But if you still for some reason have an Albon, I would be getting Pierre Gasly or maybe even Nico Hülkenberg into your team instead of the Williams driver. I just really like Gasly. I think he is very reliable. He's only had one DNF, which was in Saudi Arabia, and I've always really liked him. He's matured in the last couple of years at least, and I definitely think he will be the team leader heading into next season once they have another driver, probably more junior driver to pair up with him. So I really like Gasly as well as an $8 to $9 million asset right now. Before I get into my early team thoughts, I just wanted to revisit the talking points we covered off before. Obviously, Mercedes and Ferrari are probably the two constructors front of mind, and I think Stroll as well, given his B tier standing in a couple weeks' time, assuming all things go right for him, will probably also be another driver factoring into my plans. So I do want to quickly look at what my team currently stands at. I've also got 5.8 million in the bank, which is not something I'd usually carry week to week. It's more or less 1 to 2 million for me to have a bit of flexibility. But I think Ferrari will be a mainstay in my team for the foreseeable future, certainly while they're still under 25 million as a B tier asset. Mercedes was a punt, and even though the top 5 for the last 2 seasons has been unchanged in Spain, I believe it's double Red Bull, double Mercedes, and a Ferrari driver, I think Mercedes probably has to go. I don't think they're right now knocking on the door as a must-own asset. They are a great differential, and sure, if Lewis and George blow everyone away in free practice again, it makes for an easy hold. But I think I really, as I talked about before, like Oscar Piastri and McLaren. The problem I'm faced with, though, is even though both these assets are ready-made to go back into my team, I'm still left with Sargent, Valtteri Bottas, and Zhou. Sargent in particular, I've run this guy for the last few weeks, and I knew this DNF would come back to bite me, which it did in Canada. I just want to get this guy out of my team. And so I think realistically, the most logical approach here would be for me to activate the wildcard to also make use of that 5.6 million sitting on the sidelines. So I could go for a two-pronged attack in Leclerc and Piastri, for example, or Leclerc, Hamilton, Leclerc, Russell. But it does mean I'm lumped in with Logan Sargent. Let's say I go for George Russell, filter by value here. Throw in Zhou. Let's go Nico Hülkenberg. 7.5 doesn't give me quite enough to stretch to anyone else. 0.5 short of Bottas, and that still leaves double Sauber. So I think the most logical route for me could well be clearing out everyone and just bolstering the midfield drivers a little bit more. Double Haas, I'm thinking, and Tsunoda. That would leave me with 16.7, not Ocon, and Lance Stroll. And I really like having 2.5 million to carry into the sprint race weekend if I go for a team like this in Spain, because it can allow me to pivot to other combinations if I feel as though that suits my team. The one thing I will say, though, is having a two-pronged driver attack, two premium driver attack like Leclerc and Piastri means I think you're just seeing a bit more reliability from these guys over a sprint race weekend. So I think with Austria coming up, there needs to be an element of forward planning. But if I don't go for Leclerc because of just the reliability of someone like Max Verstappen, then let's say we drop him in here. There's 9.1 million right there, and I could get someone like Pierre Gasly. So I also really like the foundations of this team as well. Very early team thoughts for sure until we get to practice, but definitely wanted to get some initial perspective on how I want to approach my team selection. But if you guys have got any thoughts to the contrary, let me know down in the comments below. I will have a more affirmative approach to my team with my race week preview and final thoughts closer to the deadline, but I'm going to leave it all there for now, guys. As always, I appreciate you dropping by, and I'll see you all very soon.